Hello everybody, it's Sarah, and I guess it's time for me to talk about YA. More specifically, maybe some of my problems with YA, although that less so than maybe my problems with the YA community. And please, before you leave your hate comments and your dislikes, watch at least, let's say, a third of the video and listen to what I have to say, because I think some of the things that I'm going to say might be a little bit different than what you're thinking of right now, because I in no way intend to just bash people who read YA or YA literature in general. In fact, I do myself enjoy a YA book every now and again, while my preferred reading age is adult, and I think probably 2/3 of the books at least that I read are adult. I have every once in a while just a phase where I do enjoy just binging a bunch of YA books. But before we get into all of my opinions on YA and the YA community, let me sketch out a bit of the situation why I felt I wanted to make this video. The situation kind of has died down again, so maybe I'm a bit late. However, I did need time to just gather my thoughts together, so yeah. Better late than never, I guess. But the situation a few weeks ago was that once again there were people sharing their hot takes of how YA as a literary genre does not have any merit, and how people who read classics, literary fiction, or just books that are geared towards adults in general are more well-read than people who only or mostly read YA books, or adults who read only or mostly YA books, because of course there's like nothing wrong with teenagers reading a book that's for their age range. And to be honest, these hot takes are not anything new, which is why it kind of always surprises me how angry people get at them and don't just like look at them and are like, hey, stupid person once again, because it is a stupid hot take, to be honest, and like it just shows how little reflection you put into what you're reading. But anyway, I don't understand why people don't just say it's a stupid hot take and move on, but get quite enraged about those hot takes. Because these hot takes, as I said, I think they have been around for probably as long as literature has been around, especially when it comes to genre fiction. Romance has always been the subject of these hot takes, fantasy for a long time as well, although I think it has gotten better with fantasy, and YA of course as well is very frequently subject of these hot takes. And I think especially with romance and YA there is certainly an argument that can be made that a lot of times the victims of these hot takes are genres that have readers that are predominantly female, because things that have been for female enjoyment have, like, it's a tale as old as time basically, that they have been ridiculed and just made fun of. However, I am not here to analyze the reasons behind why YA gets shat on so much. The thing I want to talk about is why I have problems with the way that YA community reacts to those hot takes, and what my personal opinion is on those hot takes as well. The argument of a lot of people shitting on YA is, as far as I have seen, mostly that YA is less intellectual compared to classics or literary fiction. But that argument, that part of the argument also kind of goes a lot of times from those people against romance, against fantasy, against basically anything that's genre fiction. Other arguments are a lot of times that YA doesn't talk as much about societal problems we face or structural problems we have in our society. It's not as complex and as deep as adult fiction. And to be honest, just like on a very surface level, before going further into detail, I have to kind of agree. And that is why I have a problem with the way the YA community often reacts to those hot takes. Because the way they react, as far as I have seen, 99% of the time is, but that's not true, because there's this one book that is incredibly deep. There's this one book that talks about societal problems on a level with any literary fiction. For example, I often see The Hate U Give given as an example, which of course is an incredibly important book that talks about incredibly important issues. I think it's about police brutality specifically, and it is a YA book. Then I also have right here The Dark Materials, which, for example, has incredibly deep themes pulled throughout it that younger readers often don't even realize are in this book. I only realized how much commentary there is in this book on religion, for example, when I reread it as an almost adult, when I reread it at like 18, 19 years old. So there's certainly books that hold their own against any adult book when it comes to themes, when it comes to depth, when it comes to complexity, when it comes to talking about important issues. And then on the other hand as well, you can also give the argument, of course, that adult fiction isn't always incredibly deep and complex and doesn't always talk about the most important issues that we currently deal with in our modern world. For example, I recently read Kings of the Wild, and it was just overall a really fun ride. And of course there were themes of friendship, because those themes are in most fantasy books, but those themes are also in most YA books. But overall, the world building in this book wasn't too complex. It wasn't much more complex than most world building in YA high fantasy I have read, and would just follow a bunch of fun characters as they go on their quest. So like, there's of course YA books that are incredibly deep, and there's adult books that are just there for fun. And that brings me to my actual argument, because I find that overall, yes, YA is more shallow than a lot of adult literature, but that's okay. And I have talked recently about this in a video, that I do not like the term guilty pleasure, because I feel like it puts a worth on a book, and it says this book is a guilty pleasure book, so it's actually worth less than those other books that are works of great literary merit. And I do not think I agree with that. Because of course you can say that a lot of classics and a lot of literary fiction, especially I will talk about those two genres right now, because they're like kind of the other extreme from YA, I think. Those have a lot more literary merit than your typical average YA book. But to be honest, most of those books are also completely worthless for just having a good time. When I just want to like turn off my brain and just want to sit down, read a good book and just have fun and have a good time and have characters that I can connect with and have a story that I want to follow. And that is, to be honest, why I have a problem with the way the YA community reacted to those hot takes. Because in my opinion, by focusing on just the books that do whatever hot take person said YA doesn't do, kind of discredits everything else that YA does really well, which is what I think YA is primarily about, and that is just having a good time and bringing teenagers, mainly teenagers, but also of course adults, joy while reading. And not every book has to be the next Booker Prize winner. Not every book has to be an amazing literary work of fiction. A book can get its worth from different sources. Some books get their worth from being incredibly well crafted and written works of art. Other books get their worth from the commentary they give on our society, and some books, in which in my opinion most of YA falls into, just get their worth from the simple and pure enjoyment that they bring. Because I think that's why YA exists. It exists to make teenagers want to read, and that is okay. It doesn't have to be the next amazing book, and even by not being the next amazing book, it can still just contribute to literature in incredible ways. Because, for example, just because we had the whole Midnight Sun announcement recently, I think no one will discredit people who say that Stephenie Meyer is an incredibly problematic author, and that the book itself is also quite full of problematic stuff. And also that even discrediting all that, it's not exactly the best written book. However, even though all those things are the case, we still have to acknowledge that without Stephenie Meyer and without Twilight, YA wouldn't be what it is today. And so I think that it's kind of hard to say a book is worth more just because it's more intellectual. And of course, I personally want to be a person, which I think I don't quite manage, who is well read. But I don't think well read necessarily means that you have to have read all the classics or that you have to have read only literary fiction or anything. I actually think, for example, people who have only read YA can in some cases be more well read than people who read only literary fiction or classics. Because, for example, if you read YA has a lot of authors from different backgrounds that tell a lot of different stories from a lot of different viewpoints. I think YA is one of the genres that is currently doing best with diversity among authors and among the contents. So I think if you're someone who only reads YA but who reads a wide variety of authors, in the end you're more well read than someone who just reads classics by old white dudes. Because I think someone who only reads YA with a wide variety of authors gets a lot more different input than someone who just reads like from one demographic group. And the last thing I wanted to say is that of course classics and literary fiction, and even like in most genres within the genre, adult literature compared to YA literature gives you more intellectual stimuli than your average YA book. And I do think that we as people should always strive to stimulate ourselves intellectually. However, I do not think that we can tell whether or not a person does that by looking at their bookshelves. Because if your bookshelves are full of classics and literary fiction, the only thing that really tells me is that you have read a lot of classics and literary fiction. It doesn't tell me at all whether or not you have thought about the contents of those books and whether or not those contents of the books kind of arrived in you and changed something in you and did something, made you think or anything. And also, if you have someone who has a majority of YA books on their shelves, of course they can be someone who much more closely analyzes those YA books than someone who only reads classics. But also if a person doesn't do that because they just simply read for enjoyment, which personally I do a lot of times, they can still get their intellectual stimuli from somewhere else. You do not know, maybe they read the newspaper a lot, maybe they go into a lot of debates with different people, maybe they visit the museum a lot. You cannot really tell how intellectual someone is just by what's on their bookshelves. For example, I had the trouble a lot that my dad complained that I read too much fantasy and that I should read more proper literature. And of course I could have gone and just said, yeah, look, but for example, Game of Thrones is a book that has a lot to say about the morals of people and what makes you a moral person and not, and so on. What's the motivation behind different actions of people? I didn't do that. The thing I just said to him, which I think the YA community should say instead of trying to like point to the few books that are just as good as whatever the comparison is that the hot take person makes. The thing I think we should just do is, yeah, so what? So what if it's not as intellectual, if it's not as literary, if it doesn't deal with as many societal issues? I read for enjoyment, and that's a worth in itself. And that's what's important to me when I'm reading, because I want to get joy from reading. And of course we should always reflect on what we're reading, and we should always think on what we're reading, especially if it might be something that has harmful contents. But don't put the worth on books just simply by what literary awards it has won or with what issues it deals with, because it's just not necessary. We read for different reasons, and that's okay. And we cannot tell anything about a person from their bookshelves, basically. And yeah, that was basically all my thoughts on this topic. Like, if you read for enjoyment, be proud of it. Just don't try and go to make YA or the genre you read something it is not, because it doesn't need to be. And if YA isn't for someone else because they need those, again, intellectual stimuli or whatever, the deeper world building, something in their books, then that's also okay, but don't let them put you down for what you're reading and by trying to make what you're reading the same as what they are reading. I prefer adult fantasy simply because I usually prefer my more complex world building, my more complex character work, and just the longer books with spending more times with the characters and having just a more fleshed out story. But that doesn't mean that I don't sometimes just get the feeling of wanting to read YA because I want to read a book that's quick to get into, that's quick to get through, that has a lot of times amazing character work, because YA does have amazing character work, but that maybe is a little bit tropey because sometimes I just feel like it and sometimes I enjoy that, and that is okay, and it doesn't make YA worth any less than it does adult fantasy, than it does classics or literary fiction or whatever. And yeah, that's basically what my thoughts were on this topic. And I feel like they were kind of convoluted at times, but I hope I kind of got across what I wanted to say. And tell me in the comments down below what your thoughts were on this whole discussion, and also what your thoughts are on YA. And all the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. And if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about subscribing and also giving me a thumbs up. I have the feeling I might get some thumbs down. It depends, kind of. But yeah, give me a thumbs up in any case. And with that said, I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!